Of all the riots going, the easiest to understand is the prison riots. It really is just a bigger version of Children v Teacher, the underdog taking on the ultimate authority. What happens when a bunch of criminals with little to lose turn on their captors? You're about to find out. From strange ways in 1990 to recent uprisings in US jails, we anatomise the prison riot, from lockdown to code red.
Prison is a strange place. It maketh man act in strange ways.
Everyone in prison wants all the prisoners to unite and take over the prison and burn it down and run away for eternal freedom.
Prison riots happen for two main reasons: as a protest against prison conditions or as a result of an outbreak of violence between rival gangs. In Brazil, prison gangs are so powerful that they practically run the prisons. In 2001, when the authorities tried to crack down on inmate power, there was widespread rebellion, with 20,000 inmates taking over 27 prisons. In the extreme violence that followed, gang rivalries were settled barbarically, with 16 inmates being killed. Some had even been beheaded. Here we see the rioters shockingly hacking off a victim's head before throwing his torso off the roof. British prison riots have never been quite as bad as in Brazil, but things do still get pretty hairy. Most riots here start as a protest against the infringement of basic prisoners' rights. That's what happened at North Eye Prison in Sussex in 1985. As punishment for the misbehaviour of one prisoner, privileges and prison visits were restricted for all. This angered inmates, and some of them decided to vent their frustration by rioting. Keith Harris was serving time at North Eye and watched as prisoners attempted to destroy the jail itself.
It was a riot directed at the property. One building after another was torched. Eventually, the whole jail seemed to be ablaze.
In most prison riots, one of the first things the inmates do is go straight to the medicine cabinets to release the Class A drugs. And North Eye was no exception.
One particular inmate, he came out of the hospital with a jailer's hat on and a white smock and a medicine bag over his shoulder that he'd actually stuffed to the brim with tablets. And he was just walking around, diving his hand in and scattering a big handful of tablets over. Medication, medication.
The daddy of all British prison riots took place here at Strangeways, Manchester in 1990. The riot claimed the lives of two men, and the subsequent siege lasted for 25 days and made news headlines throughout the world. After the riot, British prison culture had changed for good. The Strangeways riot was started as a protest against prison conditions. When it was built in 1869, Strangeways was designed to hold 953 inmates. But by 1990, there were over 1,600 inmates, with some 3 to a cell. Conditions were dire. There were complaints about the poor food and accusations of staff brutality. Erica Allison served 4.5 years at Strangeways.
Most prisoners get their time. They want to do it as quietly as possible and get out as soon as possible. Some prisoners will not take the abuse. They say, no, you will not demean me, you will not take my respect, you may be more powerful than me, but you will not take my respect. Those prisoners tend to stick together, and when they do, they really are solid.
The architect of the riot was Scouser Paul Taylor. Taylor was 28 at the time and had already served 2 previous prison sentences. Paul, could you describe the relationship between the prison warders and the prisoners in Strangeways prior to the riot?
There was a poor relationship between prisoners and staff because the prison service itself was, at the time, uncivilised. And many prison officers' attitude, a devil-may-care attitude towards prisoners' welfare and needs and problems, convinced prisoners that prison officers were showing hostility and contempt towards their well-being.
In the spring of 1990, Strangeways was buzzing with accusations that a fellow inmate had been brutally assaulted by guards.
A black prisoner had been dragged down the block and ritually punched and kicked on his way to the punishment block.
Angered by the situation, Taylor formulated a plan to make a rooftop protest.
I did say to all the Scouse prisoners, quote, "Let's get these Mancunians at it. Let's get this jail rock and rolling," unquote.
Paul Taylor and his co-conspirators decided to start the riot in the prison chapel, as from there they could get easy access to the jail's roof. At the Sunday morning church service, Taylor grabbed the microphone from the chaplain and urged the prisoners to revolt. Within seconds, the guards had been overpowered by the inmates.
Mr. Bancroft, senior officer I liked, I ran towards him and I said, "Just get your men out, Mr. Bancroft. I'm giving you an opportunity to get your men out." And he called his men out and they retreated from the chapel.
They were so taken aback by the ferocity of the uprising in the chapel that they ran away and left their prison.
Having taken control of the chapel, the prisoners were soon smashing their way onto the roof. Inside, with keys stolen from retreating prison officers, the inmates went on the rampage.
It was raw in your face, real danger, real frightening stuff.
We didn't have a contingency plan for dealing with a disturbance of this size. We had got contingency plans for dealing with smaller disturbances, but we had never reckoned, and I think it would be fair to say the prison service had never reckoned, that we would lose an entire big prison.
A constant stream of casualties emerged of both guards and inmates. Inevitably, sex offenders had immediately become a target of prisoner anger.
The prisoners who were on protection in the prison became a target for the anger and wrath of prisoners who may themselves have been subjected to abuse.
And it wasn't just sex offenders who were being attacked. Old scores were also being settled.
You know, work from one area, you're from another. You know, you're interfering in our business. There's a lot of paybacks from that as well. So they were actually attacking each other at the same time.
As parts of the prison were set ablaze, fire crews and riot police rushed to the scene, as well as trained negotiator Pete Hancock.
As we were talking to them from the top landing, through the mesh, the scaffolding poles were being aimed at us, held in their hands, and it was a case that while we were talking, we were having to actually dodge the actual scaffolding pole that was going beyond us and hitting the wall at the back of us.
I told them that I couldn't be negotiated with, that I'd been attempting to negotiate better treatment for myself by the prison service in the past, and it hadn't amounted to anything. So I felt justified in being arrogant.
By that night, the prison was in the hands of the inmates. One sex offender was dead, and a guard who collapsed from a heart attack was to die 5 days later. After the break, the Strangeways riot continues as the authorities fight back with water cannons and vegetables.
They said, "Can we get some frying pans and can we get some onions?"
And Howard Marks tells us of his experiences of American prison riots.
The worst that I saw, as far as, you know, personally witnessing it, was two people trying to cut someone else's head off over breakfast.
Coming up, Howard Marks witnesses a prison beheading, and the Strangeways prison riot continues as the authorities fight back. When prison riots break out, they can be brutal. In this incident in a US jail, not even the use of tear gas can stop the violence. One person who knows exactly what it feels like to be caught up in a prison riot is Howard Marks. who survived 3 prison uprisings during 9 years in US jails.
The worst that I saw, as far as, personally witnessing it, was 2 people trying to cut someone else's head off over breakfast.
And what would you do when that went off?
Try the hell to get out of there as quickly as I possibly could. I think it lasted, it's hard to say because so much happens in small periods of time, but I would think about 5 or 6 minutes before there was just everyone rioting and nobody able to do anything about anything, unable to control it.
What sort of fear do you have?
The fear is almost neutralized by the adrenaline. I think there's very little fear exhibited there because you're in something that's kicking off, and I'm quite a scared sort of person. I don't remember feeling fear there at all, just excitement. At first, there was the euphoria, the sort of feeling, I guess, that must accompany something like raping and pillaging a sort of enemy territory or something once you've just conquered it. There seemed to be that sort of thing, people going wild, sort of ripping out the sort of guards' medical supplies or anything like that, throwing them around, perhaps dressing around with a guard's hat and swinging a truncheon around, sort of barking orders like a guard. So that sort of tomfoolery would often accompany the successful periods from the prisoner's point of view of a riot.
What about when the prisoners in riot mode actually get to confront the guards?
It can be very, very heavy indeed, particularly if the guard was one of the bad ones. I mean, if he gets caught, he's going to be lucky to get away with his life, really. I mean, they really get hammered. And the only reason they aren't killed is because, the prisoners want to keep on hammering them.
Back at Strangeways, Manchester, the guards weren't hanging around for a kicking. They'd abandoned the prison to the inmates, who were now voicing their protests from the rooftop. The thing about the Strangeways riot was the moment the protesters were on the roof, you were backing them. You didn't stop to think about what they might have done to be in jail, but you were just rooting for them, because in that instant they'd become the anti-establishment underdogs who, against all odds, had managed to take control of the prison itself.
There were the ones that everybody knew that were the potential troublemakers and things like that, but this involved everybody. This involved inmates that they had everything in front of them.
On day 2, the riot police were ready to storm Strangeways, but 5 minutes before they were about to go in, they received the order to hold back.
We had 300 staff there, all ready, all professionally trained to go in and retake their prison, because it's their prison. The decision not to go in put the morale down to the boots.
There may have been a political agenda behind the decision not to retake the prison. The day before Strangeways kicked off, the bloody battle between police and protesters on an anti-poll tax demo in London had shocked the nation and caused an outcry.
The poll tax riot was probably the biggest anti-government demonstration this country's seen for many, many years, possibly centuries. And I'm certain that it did the government no harm to have the attention switched from central London to Manchester.
I genuinely believe that the reason why the political decision not to retake the prison was linked to the fact that the government of the day wanted the poll tax out of the public domain.
It's all very well being wise after the event and saying, wouldn't it have been better if the place had been stormed after the first 2 days? But I don't believe that anybody can put his hand on his heart and say that the consequence of that would not have been very serious injury to quite a large number of people.
With plans to retake the prison abandoned, the authorities could only wait and watch as the prisoners on the rooftop entertained the nation.
Morale was very high. We would keep each other's spirits up. We would listen to the news reports, listen to music for our pleasure, and we were satisfied with our lot.
As the riot dragged on, prison officers grew more and more desperate in their attempts to bring inmates down and called in a team of psychologists. with an unusual approach.
The psychologists used what they considered to be the psychology to get them down, and that was, can we get some frying pans and can we get some onions? If we were to fry onions, it'll make them hungry and they'll give up. When we pointed out, of course, that they'd got access to the kitchen and they haven't got a problem with food, but prison officers who'd been on duty by this time 5 or 6 days were surviving on airline meals that had come from Ringway, from Manchester Airport. That lost its impetus.
Onions were soon replaced by the more traditional water cannon.
It was prison officers who were targeting prisoners with the water cannon, which made the roof slippery and could easily have resulted in a prisoner's death.
As the riot entered the second week, Paul Taylor and his hardcore protesters on the roof still showed no signs of weakening. But large sections of the prison were once again back in the hands of the authorities. In this rarely seen footage taken inside the prison during the riot, we can see exactly how the atmosphere was a strange mixture of intimidation and recreation. The authorities seemed content to play the waiting game.
For the last 15 days of the riot, Strangeways Prison was held by 13 prisoners. It shouldn't have been beyond the wit and the power of the state to retake that prison in a civilised, safe way.
I was in Manchester when the riot kicked off, and me and my mate couldn't resist coming down to have a look. And yet when we got here, a lot of the guys were on the roof and stuff was coming down and being fired up. It was actually quite a personal situation. Family members of the protesters going, "Get off that roof, come down! John, come down, son!" And one by one, prisoners did come down.
In the end, it was either they became too tired, they'd had enough, too cold, or they just simply said, right, I've done the protest and I'm coming back down.
3 weeks after the start of the riot, all but 5 prisoners had been brought down from the roof. But there were still no signs that Taylor and the other 4 were going to give in. Home Secretary David Waddington finally paid a visit.
We asked him why he had allowed this riot to continue the way it did. He didn't answer that. But then he said to the governor, I want this ending by Wednesday.
On the morning of the 25th day of the riot, the police broke through barricades and recaptured all of the upper floors.
The rioters' leader, Paul Taylor, was now taunting prison officers with a riot shield stolen during an earlier encounter. There were astonishing scenes as inches apart prison officers and rioters argued. Their message to the prisoners, you've nowhere left to run.
Cornered on the roof, the standoff continued all afternoon. But just after 6 p.m, a cherry picker was sent in and the 5 were given an ultimatum.
If you don't get in the cherry picker now, then the staff will come up and then they will take you down, whichever way that may be. And every one of them just sort of smiled and said, all right, boss, we're coming down.
Watched by the men they'd mocked for 25 days, the rioters entered the basket one by one. Taylor, the man who'd started the riot, the last to surrender. Britain's longest prison siege was over.
The riot claimed 2 lives and 194 staff and prisoners suffered injuries. 23 inmates received a total of 140 years for their part in the riots. And a new offence was placed on the statute books, prison mutiny, maximum sentence 10 years. After the riot, Strangeways was gutted and rebuilt for a cost of £55 million. There was also a report about the riots written by Lord Wolfe, which was the most radical reassessment of the British prison system in over 100 years.
There was concrete evidence that was given at and accepted by the Wolfe inquiry that numerous warnings, specific warnings about the time and the date of the protest were given to staff. They could have stopped the service, they could have stopped known troublemakers going to the service, they didn't want to. It suited the staff to have what they thought was going to be a quiet riot, because they would then use that to oppose further reforms.
But the Strangeways riot and the subsequent Wolf report brought about the very reforms that had been resisted by some members of the prison service. Clearly, this riot had worked.
The first thing was the end to slopping out. Wolf proposed that immediately. The government brought it in within about 2 years. All cells are now furnished with internal sanitation. They installed telephones, a massive boost to prisoners, you know, being able to, and their families, to be able to keep in contact with their families by telephone. They changed the visiting system. Instead of 1 visit a month, it became 1 visit a week. They didn't come about because the Home Office suddenly decided that we've got to start treating prisoners in a more civilised way. They came about because the riot exposed the conditions.
Paul Taylor received an extra 10 years punishment for his part in the riot, and he finally left prison in 2001.
I would applaud the prison service today for becoming more concerned with rehabilitation, because that was its duty by law. But I'm not pleased about the prison sentence I received, or the fact that my family suffered many, many years of upset as a consequence of my willfulness.
The Strangeways riot led to a massive improvement in prison conditions, but it hasn't stopped the rioting. In the past 15 years, there have been over 20 major prison riots in the UK. It appears that if you keep a group of men confined in a space for a prolonged period of time, there will always be reasons to kick off. Next time on I Predict a Riot, revolting crusties go wild in London's Hyde Park.